Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And apologies in advance that there's a slight sheen to my face. I'm just constantly too warm at the moment. And so this is lovely natural sweat. But I am just, yeah, it's very, very warm. Even though the amount of light would make it look like that's not the case. But there we go. But anyway, today I'm going to talk just a little bit about the books that I've been reading this week. And I hope you're having a really good week and keeping well. First up, the New York Times list recently mentioned Alan Hollinghurst's The Line of Beauty as one of its books, and it made me think that I haven't actually read anything else by him apart from that book. So I looked at kind of what I could find in my local library and found the audiobook for the swimming pool library, and I really loved this. I thought this was great fun. The core idea, as with a lot of Alan Hollinghurst's books, really is sort of focusing on the sort of inner private lives, I guess, of particularly queer men. And in Swimming Pool Library, it's sort of a very specific time of kind of, in many ways, the sort of pre-HIV world of really capturing this sort of group of men, particularly who sort of hang out in sort of saunas and gyms and kind of working men's clubs and sort of private members clubs and all these sorts of things. And particularly the kind of interplay between some of that. So we have a character at the heart of it who is preparing to sort of write a biography of this of Charles Nantwich, this sort of dramatic figure who sort of has been kind of almost in the background of a lot of things happening around kind of popular and famous gay and bisexual men, and he. I think what really makes this book so much fun is just the level of kind of joy that really comes up in this book. There's a lot of him talking about various characters having sex or talking about sex or talking frankly about kind of being around each other. And it's kind of quite satisfying and quite enjoyable to read a book about queer characters that is mostly focused on, yeah, the sort of joyous aspects, the kind of friendships, the bonds, the kind of little bits of cattish or sort of catty play between them. As opposed to sort of stories that might focus a bit more on death or violence or fear or particularly the sort of the spectre of something like HIV and AIDS. Those things are really important and they really deserve to be written about as well. But there's something about this book that's so joyous in talking about just like sex and love and all these sorts of things. And I think it's just, I kind of got the feeling that Alan Hollinghurst had a lot of fun writing this as well. Next up, I read Mary and the Rabbit Dream by Noémi Kiss-Deáki. And this is a wild book in many ways. And apparently the author also wrote this in about 2 weeks, which is bonkers. But also, I think, makes a kind of sense in the sense of the sort of frenetic energy of this book. It feels like it's sort of been like splurged and in kind of this sort of almost like slightly trance-like fashion. The idea is so a real life case. So a woman called Mary Toft in the late 1700s, I think it was, who became a sort of publicly known figure to some degree, because she the sort of rumor was around that she was able to give birth to rabbits, and the book kind of looks at this sort of case from the sort of side really focusing in on Mary's life. So essentially she was a poor woman who was sort of duped to some degree into thinking that this would be her path to fortune. So people would basically insert a rabbit into her and then have her birth it. And this all sort of led to these situations where, she became this sort of freak show sort of character, and doctors would come over to try and see it and almost to make their own careers as well of being the person who either proved or disproved this thing. But I think what really emerges in this book is this really beautiful look into her life, because, in often a lot of the stories presents with sort of ridicule that she was this character that thought that she could trick someone with this. And actually the book looks at how she herself was a victim within this. People were kind of using her body to try and make money. Then doctors would come around and prod at her body. And so it actually talks a lot about particularly women's reproductive health and the fact that so often, women's bodies are just sort of treated like objects that are kind of examined. And I think this book really delves into that in a really interesting way. It sort of allows that conversation to happen whilst also allowing a bigger conversation, um, and sort of the bigger plot of the novel to come through as well. So I think this is really exceptionally done. There's a sort of dreamlike quality to the way that phrases repeat and echo with each other. Like he'll say, you know, this man was not satisfied. In fact, this man was dissatisfied. That his dissatisfaction was blah blah blah. And there's this kind of echoing that constantly appears throughout the text that I thought was so interesting, and kind of gives this slightly sort of almost like tattling kind of energy. It's almost like someone sort of passing on a rumor to somebody else down the hall, and I really loved that about this book. Next up, I read This Is How You Remember It by Catherine Prasifka. And this book really looks at that kind of very odd stage. I'm basically fall into this age gap as well, this sort of age range of people who sort of grew up in a time, and sort of were teenagers when the internet was just starting to become more of a household thing, and then sort of ended up as adults in a world that's very sort of internet saturated. And so what we see at the beginning of this book is a young woman who basically, because of sort of what people around her are doing, feels the need to take various images of herself, particularly kind of naked ones. And she's quite young at this stage. And this sort of becomes more and more of a thing where, you know, she enjoys the fact that there's a sort of validation that comes from people seeing your image and liking it, and the kind of power that can come from it, but it's a power that can almost be taken back away from you at any time. And so she talks about how this young woman sort of eventually has a situation where a video or sort of images are shared of her across a school, and so suddenly she knows that she almost immediately that power is taken away from her, where she sort of goes from being like the cool one who sort of knows about sex to being kind of that person who we don't look at, you know. And she then talks this character we then sort of follow into her sort of late teenage years pardon me, and sort of early 20s as she's sort of off to university. And what that sort of shows is almost the knock-on effects of this idea of having to hide or feeling like you're sort of somewhat different and othered. You're kind of not wanting to trust anyone because trust is the thing that got you into trouble in the first place. And I think this book really handles that sort of very awkward element of internet culture really, really well. It's very well observed. I think it could be very internet is bad. And I never really trust novels that do that. I think for me, this novel feels like it sort of acknowledges something else here. The ways that these things are weaponized, and the ways that if we feel like we don't fit in, we seek things that will help us fit in. And sometimes those things are just as damaging as not fitting in the first place. And I think this book does that really, really cleverly. And last but not least, I Will Crash by Rebecca Watson. I really loved her last book, Little Scratch, which is her first book, and it does a very similar thing in terms of the text formatting. So if you sort of look at a physical book of this, then the text sort of overlaps, where you've got kind of almost the left-hand side is where most of the text is, but occasionally little sort of interruptions on the right-hand side, or sometimes the text sort of goes across in one line with spaces in between, and sometimes it kind of is broken up. And it's kind of a sort of fractured thing. In Little Scratch, that worked really well to talk about trauma following an assault. And in this book, I think it really looks at the kind of fracturing of thought, particularly around loss. So our kind of main character, Rosa, she has lost her brother. And so the book looks at the various ways that she almost has these interrupting thoughts of remembering him, or of being worried about something, or of having flashbacks to certain conversations she had with him or with the rest of her family. And so the book kind of interrogates those sorts of thoughts, but using the form of this sort of broken up language. And this is where I think it's really effective. People who've been watching long enough will hear me bang on about this enough, but I love this idea of sort of form and function marrying together. So the idea that if you're going to do something, if you're going to tell the story in a traditional way, that's because that should best serve your story. Likewise for sort of a kind of more experimental element. And I think this is exactly that sort of thing, where the experimental element of kind of breaking up the text on the page really tells the story as well, because often there are interrupting thoughts, there are text messages that come in while she's thinking about something else, there are moments where she is balancing different conversations, and that is exactly the kind of fractured thought process that she is talking about with grief and with loss, and the ways that suddenly you can think of somebody, like a situation from your 7th birthday or something, and that sort of little flashbulb memory appears in a way that you didn't ask it to or expect it to, but it has some kind of bearing on the current moment, and so it makes sense to slot in against those other thoughts. And so I think this is a really bold and assured use of that, and I really enjoyed the story and how this book tells it. It sort of does something really quite special and quite moving, I think, with it quite often as well. And last but not least, Parade by Rachel Cusk. I have had a bit of a sort of, not to say hit and miss, I've only read a couple of Rachel Cusk's books. Second Place, the one that was longlisted for the Booker, I didn't fully get. I kind of appreciated some of what it was doing, and kind of but didn't sort of fully feel like I was part of that world. A non-fiction book of hers I read, I really enjoyed. And this book sort of falls somewhere in the middle of those for me as well. So Parade talks a lot about very kind of, from what I understand about Cusk, very kind of Cuskian topics in terms of motherhood, art, the role of work, the sort of, particularly the role of women in art and work and motherhood and all these sorts of things. And so we follow sort of several different artists who are all called G, but they seem to be referring, I think, if I'm right, to different people. As in, it feels like there's a sort of, each of the Gs, when they get mentioned, are kind of these slightly different people who I think are real life figures, or kind of based on real life figures. And in many ways, we sort of follow through on these sorts of topics. The idea of, what does it mean to kind of give yourself over to being an artist? What does it mean to work? Is that compromised by something like motherhood, or by parenthood in general? Is it compromised by sort of gendered expectations? All of these sorts of things. And so we sort of see, this book almost reads, again, I don't know if I'm misreading it, it almost read like non-fiction to me. It feels like a sort of essay on these topics, with characters introduced to sort of talk about those issues, rather than a sort of distinct narrative of, I'm following character A and I'm watching her entire trajectory through life. The character is sort of there to help facilitate a conversation. The character's almost delivering some of these essays or sort of monologue aspects of the book. And so I did think a lot of it was really interesting, if at times I sort of lost the thread of where it was sort of going. But I do think there's something so confident and bold in her writing style that kind of captures me. There's something where you sort of feel like she's really going somewhere. She's thought this through. There's a distinct end point she's heading towards, and a thought, and you just need to keep up with her. And so I thought this was really interesting, particularly talking, there's a passage, and this doesn't spoil anything, but there's a passage where she talks about a character's mum closing the door on them, but at the same time this artist in interviews talks about how becoming a mother ruined her career and her artwork. But equally, the child is saying, well, I never had, you say this, but I actually never saw you, because you were always behind a closed door doing your work. So which is it? Like, did you try to do the work and couldn't do it because of me? Or, and it kind of plays up that kind of idea of actually sort of to give yourself over to one of these two things means a sacrifice of another thing. And I thought that was quite interesting, at least, as well. And so those are the books that I've been reading this week. I hope you're also having a really good reading week, and I shall speak to you all soon. Take care. I hope you're not melting in the way that I am, and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.